This is Chapter 8, Risk Response and Recovery. This is Part 1, Risk Management and Information Security, the process of risk management and risk analysis. Chapter 8 is so extensive that we actually have 4 recorded lectures. So let's get started. Here are the topics for Chapter 8. I'm not going to read them all. I'll leave this up here for a few seconds so you can read it. Here are the goals. When you complete this chapter, you'll be able to understand the principles of risk management, understand how to respond to and analyze incidents, understand how to prevent and recover from outages using a business continuity plan, and how risk management relates to data security. Our learning objective, the overarching learning objective, is to describe the principles of risk management, common response techniques, and issues related to recovery of IT systems. Our key concepts include quantitative and qualitative risk assessment approaches, business impact analysis or BIA, business continuity plan or BCP, disaster recovery plan or DRP, and the elements of an incident response plan. So let's talk about risk management and information security. Risk management is a central concern in information security. You cannot eliminate all risk in an organization. An organization must seek the balance between an acceptable level of a risk and the cost of reducing it. Different organizations have different risk tolerances. 2 key risk management principles: never spend more to protect an asset than it is worth, and a countermeasure without a corresponding risk is a solution seeking a problem. You can never justify the cost of that countermeasure. You must help identify serious risks. You must also help create and/or maintain a plan that makes sure your company continues to operate in the face of a disaster. This is a business continuity plan or BCP. So let's talk about definitions of risk. Risk is the likelihood or probability that a particular threat exposes a vulnerability that could damage your organization. As a security professional, you must be familiar with these 3 concepts. Vulnerability, a flaw or weakness in your system security procedures, design, implementation, or internal controls. Threat, the potential for an attacker or event to exploit a specific vulnerability. An attacker or event that may exploit a vulnerability is also a threat source. A threat source is an intent and method to exploit a vulnerability. A threat source is also known as a threat agent. An impact, the amount of harm a threat exploiting a vulnerability can cause. Some risks are more likely to occur than others. Likelihood is the probability that a potential threat will exploit a vulnerability. An example would be there's a high likelihood a virus or other malware will infect an internet-connected system that does not have any antivirus software running on it. When a threat is realized, an organization experiences either an event or an incident. An event is a measurable occurrence that has an impact on the business, and an incident is an event that has negative impact on operations. Incidents are events that justify a countermeasure. For example, warehouse theft is an incident, and the countermeasure for that might be closed circuit TV, gates on doors, alarm systems, and so forth. Attack dogs, you name it. Safeguards address gaps or weaknesses in controls that could otherwise lead to an exploit. So a CCTV might be system to prevent theft could be a safeguard. And countermeasures counter or address a specific threat, whereas CCTV may not really just be there for theft. A countermeasure like some kind of specific alarm or specific device might be there to address that particular threat. The elements of risk. Assets, vulnerabilities, and threats are all elements of risk. Assets increase or decline in value. Don't assume all threats come from the outside. According to the FBI and Verizon Terramark's 2012, and I know this is old, data breach incident report, while fewer than 10% of all attacks are insider attacks, their impact is proportionally far worse, mainly because somebody who's on the inside knows exactly where the data is, knows what the value of the data is, and knows how to exploit it. And so an insider attack may actually be more dreadful to an organization than an external attack. New threats appear all the time. The U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, U.S. CERT, regularly releases information on new threats by secure email, and that's their website. So the purpose of risk management is to reduce risk to tolerable levels. You must identify risks before they lead to an incident in time to enable you to plan and begin risk handling activities, controls, and countermeasures on a continuous basis across the life of the product, system, or project. You can almost never reduce risk to zero. After identifying the risk culture of an organization, you need to evaluate risks and reduce the ones that might have a major effect on the organization. And then reduce the ones that might have a major effect on the organization. You must be able to justify the costs of risk reduction methods. The risk equation in 3 phases of risk management. Risk management includes risk assessment, risk mitigation, and risk evaluation and assurance. Note that risk management is a continuous effort. This cycle keeps going around and around. It includes periodic reevaluation of risk and risk assessment in all 3 phases of the risk management effort. First, you have to assess what's going on, identification of risks, evaluation of them, evaluation of the risk impact, and recommendation of risk-reducing measures. From risk mitigation to evaluation assurance, you have risk avoidance, risk mitigation, risk acceptance, risk transference, and evaluation of risks. And from evaluation assurance to risk assessment, it's ongoing and periodic evaluation along with regulatory compliance. In the little box at the bottom, risk avoidance, mitigation, acceptance, and transference, we'll talk about those specifically in a little bit. The process of risk management and analysis. So here we go, overview of risk management. The next step is risk identification. Risk assessment includes risk control. You select a strategy and justify the controls. In risk assessment, you also have to do the inventory of assets, classify them, and identify threats and vulnerabilities. When you're identifying risks, you have to ask, what could go wrong? Fire, flood, earthquake, loss of electricity or other utility, strike, transportation unavailability. You have to develop scenarios for each threat in order to assess the threat. In risk assessment, you can't measure all the identified risks. This is described in more detail on the next slide. Inventory of assets. Create an inventory of assets so you can assess the loss when you assess the risk. Classify them according to their value to the business. Every asset has a different value to the business. A tractor trailer may have no value or very little value to a large corporation like Coca-Cola. But ingredient 7X, which makes Coca-Cola Coca-Cola, is probably the most highly guarded trade secret in the world. And then identify the threats and vulnerabilities to each asset and compare them with the proposed controls to find if the controls are still appropriate. Risk assessment involves 3 aspects. The assessment of various types of controls to mitigate the risks that you identify. The selection of a control strategy. Consider reliability, scalability, and cost, as well as ease of use and safety. The justification of choice of controls. Compare the cost of all controls with the associated risk. Some steps here. Identify threats and vulnerabilities. When a threat exploits a vulnerability, a risk occurs. Threats and vulnerabilities are identified as risks. Identify the likelihood that a risk will occur. This can be based on historical data or opinions. For example, imagine a risk occurred an average of 6 times in the past 3 years. If no steps are taken to reduce this risk, it will probably occur 2 times next year. If historical data isn't available, experts can provide opinions on the likelihood of the risk occurring. Identify the asset values. The value of assets helps to determine the impact of a risk. The assets can be hardware assets, which the value of can be easy to um, determine. You paid X for that server and it's depreciated so much in the past year. Software assets, again, you paid so much for that software license or data, which is very hard to determine because it's often hard to determine how much that data is worth to the company. It could be immeasurable. It could be very difficult to determine. Some risks can affect all three. Determine the impact of a risk. This can also be based on historical data or opinions. Imagine a risk resulted in losses averaging 20,000 a year in the past 3 years. If no steps are taken to reduce the risk, it will probably result in a loss of about 20,000 next year. If historical data isn't available, experts can provide opinions on the impact of the risk occurring. Determine the usefulness of a safeguard or control. Safeguards or controls are used to reduce the risk or reduce the impact. Some controls will be more effective than others. The risk assessment helps determine which ones to implement. Risk analysis. Good risk analysis explains the company's risk environment to managers in terms that they understand. It explains what risk could stop a company from operating. During this process, remain focused on what does this mean to the company and what is the value of this to the company, rather than what does this mean for my systems and infrastructure. Because again, we are here in service of the organization or the company. Risk analysis identifies and justifies risk mitigation efforts. Risk mitigation identifies threats to the business processes and data systems, and risk analysis justifies the use of specific countermeasures to reduce risk. Emerging threats. Perform risk assessment on emerging threats. Some examples of emerging threats include new technology, changes in the culture of the organization or environment, unauthorized use of technology such as wireless technologies, rogue modems, PDAs, smartphones, tablets, etc., changes in regulations and laws, and changes in business practices, for example, outsourcing and globalization. Periodically, do risk analysis to find emerging threats and vulnerabilities. So this is the end of part one. Part two will discuss quantitative risk analysis, qualitative risk analysis, and developing a strategy for risk analysis.